Chapter 21. The Expedition. It was a cheerless morning when they got into the street, blowing and raining hard, and the clouds looking dull and stormy. The night had been very wet, large pools of water had collected in the road, and the kennels were overflowing. There was a faint glimmering of the coming day in the sky, but it rather aggravated than relieved the gloom of the scene, the sombre light only serving to pale that which the street lamps afforded, without shedding any warmer or brighter tints upon the wet housetops and dreary streets. There appeared to be nobody stirring in that quarter of the town, the windows of the houses were all closely shut, and the streets through which they passed, were noiseless and empty. By the time they had turned into the Bethnal Green Road, the day had fairly begun to break. Many of the lamps were already extinguished, a few country wagons were slowly toiling on, towards London, now and then, a stage-coach, covered with mud, rattled briskly by, the driver bestowing, as he passed, an admonitory lash upon the heavy wagoner who, by keeping on the wrong side of the road, had endangered his arriving at the office, a quarter of a minute after his time. The public houses, with gas lights burning inside, were already open. By degrees, other shops began to be unclosed, and a few scattered people were met with. Then, came straggling groups of laborers going to their work, then, men and women with fish baskets on their heads, donkey carts laden with vegetables, chaise carts filled with livestock or whole carcasses of meat, milkwomen with pails, an unbroken concourse of people, trudging out with various supplies to the eastern suburbs of the town. As they approached the city, the noise and traffic gradually increased. When they threaded the streets between Shoreditch and Smithfield, it had swelled into a roar of sound and bustle. It was as light as it was likely to be, till night came on again, and the busy morning of half the London population had begun. Turning down Sun Street and Crown Street, and crossing Finsbury Square, Mr. Sykes struck, by way of Chiswell Street, into Barbican, thence into Long Lane, and so into Smithfield, from which latter place arose a tumult of discordant sounds that filled Oliver Twist with amazement. It was market morning. The ground was covered, nearly ankle deep, with filth and mire, a thick steam, perpetually rising from the reeking bodies of the cattle, and mingling with the fog, which seemed to rest upon the chimney tops, hung heavily above. All the pens in the centre of the large area, and as many temporary pens as could be crowded into the vacant space, were filled with sheep. Tied up to posts by the gutter side were long lines of beasts and oxen, 3 or 4 deep. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thieves, idlers, and vagabonds of every low grade, were mingled together in a mass, the whistling of drovers, the barking dogs, the bellowing and plunging of the oxen, the bleating of sheep, the grunting and squeaking of pigs, the cries of hawkers, the shouts, oaths, and quarrelling on all sides, the ringing of bells and roar of voices, that issued from every public-house, the crowding, pushing, driving, beating, whooping and yelling, the hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid, and dirty figures constantly running to and fro, and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene, which quite confounded the senses. Mr. Sykes, dragging Oliver after him, elbowed his way through the thickest of the crowd, and bestowed very little attention on the numerous sights and sounds, which so astonished the boy. He nodded, twice or thrice, to a passing friend, and, resisting as many invitations to take a morning dram, pressed steadily onward, until they were clear of the turmoil, and had made their way through Hosier Lane into Holborn. "Now, young un," said Sykes, looking up at the clock of St. Andrew's Church, hard upon 7. "You must step out. Come, don't lag behind already, lazy legs." Mr. Sykes accompanied this speech with a jerk at his little companion's wrist. Oliver, quickening his pace into a kind of trot between a fast walk and a run, kept up with the rapid strides of the housebreaker as well as he could. They held their course at this rate, until they had passed Hyde Park Corner, and were on their way to Kensington, when Sykes relaxed his pace, until an empty cart which was at some little distance behind, came up. Seeing "Hounslow" written on it, he asked the driver with as much civility as he could assume, if he would give them a lift as far as Isleworth. "Jump up," said the man. "Is that your boy?" "Yes, he's my boy," replied Sikes, looking hard at Oliver, and putting his hand abstractedly into the pocket where the pistol was. "Your father walks rather too quick for you, don't he, my man?" inquired the driver, seeing that Oliver was out of breath. "Not a bit of it," replied Sikes, interposing. "He's used to it. Here, take hold of my hand, Ned. In with you." Thus addressing Oliver, he helped him into the cart, and the driver, pointing to a heap of sacks, told him to lie down there, and rest himself. As they passed the different milestones, Oliver wondered, more and more, where his companion meant to take him. Kensington, Hammersmith, Chiswick, Kew Bridge, Brentford, were all passed, and yet they went on as steadily as if they had only just begun their journey. At length, they came to a public house called the Coach and Horses, a little way beyond which, another road appeared to run off. And here, the cart stopped. Sikes dismounted with great precipitation, holding Oliver by the hand all the while, and lifting him down directly, bestowed a furious look upon him, and rapped the side pocket with his fist, in a significant manner. "Good-bye, boy," said the man. "He's sulky," replied Sikes, giving him a shake, "he's sulky. A young dog. Don't mind him." "Not I," rejoined the other, getting into his cart. "It's a fine day, after all." And he drove away. Sikes waited until he had fairly gone, and then, telling Oliver he might look about him if he wanted, once again led him onward on his journey. They turned round to the left, a short way past the public house, and then, taking a right-hand road, walked on for a long time, passing many large gardens and gentlemen's houses on both sides of the way, and stopping for nothing but a little beer, until they reached a town. Here against the wall of a house, Oliver saw written up in pretty large letters, Hampton. They lingered about, in the fields, for some hours. At length they came back into the town, and, turning into an old public house with a defaced signboard, ordered some dinner by the kitchen fire. The kitchen was an old, low-roofed room, with a great beam across the middle of the ceiling, and benches, with high backs to them, by the fire, on which were seated several rough men in smock frocks, drinking and smoking. They took no notice of Oliver, and very little of Sikes, and, as Sikes took very little notice of them, he and his young comrade sat in a corner by themselves, without being much troubled by their company. They had some cold meat for dinner, and sat so long after it, while Mr. Sikes indulged himself with 3 or 4 pipes, that Oliver began to feel quite certain they were not going any further. Being much tired with the walk, and getting up so early, he dozed a little at first, then, quite overpowered by fatigue and the fumes of the tobacco, fell asleep. It was quite dark when he was awakened by a push from Sikes. Rousing himself sufficiently to sit up and look about him, he found that worthy in close fellowship and communication with a labouring man, over a pint of ale. "So, you're going on to Lower Halliford, are you?" inquired Sikes. "Yes, I am," replied the man, who seemed a little the worse, or better, as the case might be, for drinking, and not slow about it neither. "My horse hasn't got a load behind him going back, as he had coming up in the mornin', and he won't be long doing of it. Here's luck to him. Ecod! He's a good un. Could you give my boy and me a lift as far as there?" demanded Sikes, pushing the ale towards his new friend. "If you're going directly, I can," replied the man, looking out of the pot. "Are you going to Halliford?" "Going on to Shepperton," replied Sikes. "I'm your man, as far as I go," replied the other. "Is all paid, Becky?" "Yes, the other gentleman's paid," replied the girl. "I say," said the man, with tipsy gravity, "that won't do, you know." "Why not?" rejoined Sikes. "You're going to accommodate us, and what's to prevent my standing treat for a pint or so, in return?" The stranger reflected upon this argument, with a very profound face. Having done so, he seized Sikes by the hand, and declared he was a real good fellow. To which Mr. Sikes replied, he was joking, as, if he had been sober, there would have been strong reason to suppose he was. After the exchange of a few more compliments, they bade the company good night, and went out, the girl gathering up the pots and glasses as they did so, and lounging out to the door, with her hands full, to see the party start. The horse, whose health had been drunk in his absence, was standing outside, ready harnessed to the cart. Oliver and Sikes got in without any further ceremony, and the man to whom he belonged, having lingered for a minute or two, to bear him up, and to defy the hostler in the world to produce his equal, mounted also. Then, the hostler was told to give the horse his head, and, his head being given him, he made a very unpleasant use of it, tossing it into the air with great disdain, and running into the parlor windows over the way, after performing those feats, and supporting himself for a short time on his hind legs, he started off at great speed, and rattled out of the town right gallantly. The night was very dark. A damp mist rose from the river, and the marshy ground about, and spread itself over the dreary fields. It was piercing cold, too, all was gloomy and black. Not a word was spoken, for the driver had grown sleepy, and Sikes was in no mood to lead him into conversation. Oliver sat huddled together, in a corner of the cart, bewildered with alarm and apprehension, and figuring strange objects in the gaunt trees, whose branches waved grimly to and fro, as if in some fantastic joy at the desolation of the scene. As they passed Sunbury Church, the clock struck 7. There was a light in the ferry house window opposite, which streamed across the road, and threw into more sombre shadow a dark yew tree with graves beneath it. There was a dull sound of falling water not far off, and the leaves of the old tree stirred gently in the night wind. It seemed like quiet music for the repose of the dead. Sunbury was passed through, and they came again into the lonely road. 2 or 3 miles more, and the cart stopped. Sikes alighted, took Oliver by the hand, and they once again walked on. They turned into no house at Shepperton, as the weary boy had expected, but still kept walking on, in mud and darkness, through gloomy lanes and over cold open wastes, until they came within sight of the lights of a town at no great distance. On looking intently forward, Oliver saw that the water was just below them, and that they were coming to the foot of a bridge. Sikes kept straight on, until they were close upon the bridge, then turned suddenly down a bank upon the left. The water, thought Oliver, turning sick with fear. He has brought me to this lonely place to murder me. He was about to throw himself on the ground, and make one struggle for his young life, when he saw that they stood before a solitary house, all ruinous and decayed. There was a window on each side of the dilapidated entrance, and 1 story above, but no light was visible. The house was dark, dismantled, and, to all appearance, uninhabited. Sikes, with Oliver's hand still in his, softly approached the low porch, and raised the latch. The door yielded to the pressure, and they passed in together. Chapter 22. The Burglary. "Hullo!" cried a loud, hoarse voice, as soon as they set foot in the passage. "Don't make such a row," said Sikes, bolting the door. "Show a glim, Toby." "Aha!" "My pal," cried the same voice. "A glim, Barney, a glim." "Show the gentleman in, Barney, wake up first, if convenient." The speaker appeared to throw a bootjack, or some such article, at the person he addressed, to rouse him from his slumbers, for the noise of a wooden body, falling violently, was heard, and then an indistinct muttering, as of a man between sleep and awake. "Do you hear?" cried the same voice. "There's Bill Sikes in the passage with nobody to do the civil to him, and you sleeping there, as if you took laudanum with your meals, and nothing stronger. Are you any fresher now, or do you want the iron candlestick to wake you thoroughly?" A pair of slipshod feet shuffled, hastily, across the bare floor of the room, as this interrogatory was put, and there issued, from a door on the right hand, first, a feeble candle, and next, the form of the same individual who has been heretofore described as laboring under the infirmity of speaking through his nose, and officiating as waiter at the public-house on Saffron Hill. "Mr. Sykes," exclaimed Barney, with real or counterfeit joy, "Cub ID, sir, Cub ID. Here. You get on first," said Sykes, putting Oliver in front of him. "Quicker. Or I shall tread upon your heels." Muttering a curse upon his tardiness, Sykes pushed Oliver before him, and they entered a low dark room with a smoky fire, 2 or 3 broken chairs, a table, and a very old couch, on which, with his legs much higher than his head, a man was reposing at full length, smoking a long clay pipe. He was dressed in a smartly cut snuff-colored coat, with large brass buttons, an orange neckerchief, a coarse, staring, shawl-pattern waistcoat, and drab breeches. Mr. Crackit, for he it was, had no very great quantity of hair either upon his head or face, but what he had, was of a reddish dye, and tortured into long corkscrew curls, through which he occasionally thrust some very dirty fingers, ornamented with large common rings. He was a trifle above the middle size, and apparently rather weak in the legs, but this circumstance by no means detracted from his own admiration of his top boots, which he contemplated, in their elevated situation, with lively satisfaction. "Bill, my boy," said this figure, turning his head towards the door, "I'm glad to see you. I was almost afraid you'd given it up, in which case I should have made a personal winter. Hullo!" Uttering this exclamation in a tone of great surprise, as his eyes rested on Oliver, Mr. Toby Crackit brought himself into a sitting posture, and demanded who that was. "The boy." "Only the boy," replied Sykes, drawing a chair towards the fire. "Wood of Bister Fagid's lads," exclaimed Barney, with a grin. "Fagins, exclaimed Toby, looking at Oliver. "What an inwailable boy that'll make, for the old lady's pockets in chapels. His mug is a fortin to him." There's enough of that," interposed Sykes, impatiently, and stooping over his recumbent friend, he whispered a few words in his ear, at which Mr. Crackit laughed immensely, and honored Oliver with a long stare of astonishment. "Now," said Sykes, as he resumed his seat, "if you'll give us something to eat and drink while we're waiting, you'll put some heart in us, or in me, at all events. Sit down by the fire, younker, and rest yourself, for you'll have to go out with us again tonight, though not very far off." Oliver looked at Sykes, in mute and timid wonder, and drawing a stool to the fire, sat with his aching head upon his hands, scarcely knowing where he was, or what was passing around him. "Here," said Toby, as the young Jew placed some fragments of food, and a bottle upon the table, "success to the crack." He rose to honor the toast, and, carefully depositing his empty pipe in a corner, advanced to the table, filled a glass with spirits, and drank off its contents. Mr. Sykes did the same. "A drain for the boy," said Toby, half filling a wineglass. "Down with it, innocence." "Indeed," said Oliver, looking piteously up into the man's face, "indeed, I." "Down with it," echoed Toby. "Do you think I don't know what's good for you? Tell him to drink it, Bill." "He had better," said Sykes, clapping his hand upon his pocket. "Burn my body, if he isn't more trouble than a whole family of dodgers. Drink it, you perverse imp, drink it." Frightened by the menacing gestures of the two men, Oliver hastily swallowed the contents of the glass, and immediately fell into a violent fit of coughing, which delighted Toby Crackit and Barney, and even drew a smile from the surly Mr. Sykes. This done, and Sykes having satisfied his appetite, Oliver could eat nothing but a small crust of bread which they made him swallow. The two men laid themselves down on chairs for a short nap. Oliver retained his stool by the fire. Barney, wrapped in a blanket, stretched himself on the floor, close outside the fender. They slept, or appeared to sleep, for some time, nobody stirring but Barney, who rose once or twice to throw coals on the fire. Oliver fell into a heavy doze, imagining himself straying along the gloomy lanes, or wandering about the dark churchyard, or retracing some one or other of the scenes of the past day, when he was roused by Toby Crackit jumping up and declaring it was 1:30. In an instant, the other two were on their legs, and all were actively engaged in busy preparation. Sikes and his companion enveloped their necks and chins in large dark shawls, and drew on their greatcoats. Barney, opening a cupboard, brought forth several articles, which he hastily crammed into the pockets. "Barkers for me, Barney," said Toby Crackit. "Here they are," replied Barney, producing a pair of pistols. "You loaded them yourself?" "All right," replied Toby, stowing them away. "The persuaders?" "I've got 'em," replied Sikes. "Crape, keys, centerbits, darkies, nothing forgotten?" inquired Toby, fastening a small crowbar to a loop inside the skirt of his coat. "All right," rejoined his companion. "Bring them bits of timber, Barney. That's the time of day." With these words, he took a thick stick from Barney's hands, who, having delivered another to Toby, busied himself in fastening on Oliver's cape. "Now then," said Sikes, holding out his hand. Oliver, who was completely stupefied by the unwonted exercise, and the air, and the drink which had been forced upon him, put his hand mechanically into that which Sikes extended for the purpose. "Take his other hand, Toby," said Sikes. "Look out, Barney." The man went to the door, and returned to announce that all was quiet. The two robbers issued forth with Oliver between them. Barney, having made all fast, rolled himself up as before, and was soon asleep again. It was now intensely dark. The fog was much heavier than it had been in the early part of the night, and the atmosphere was so damp, that, although no rain fell, Oliver's hair and eyebrows, within a few minutes after leaving the house, had become stiff with the half-frozen moisture that was floating about. They crossed the bridge, and kept on towards the lights which he had seen before. They were at no great distance off, and, as they walked pretty briskly, they soon arrived at Chertsey. "Slap through the town," whispered Sikes, "there'll be nobody in the way, tonight, to see us." Toby acquiesced, and they hurried through the main street of the little town, which at that late hour was wholly deserted. A dim light shone at intervals from some bedroom window, and the hoarse barking of dogs occasionally broke the silence of the night. But there was nobody abroad. They had cleared the town, as the church bell struck 2. Quickening their pace, they turned up a road upon the left hand. After walking about a quarter of a mile, they stopped before a detached house surrounded by a wall, to the top of which, Toby Crackit, scarcely pausing to take breath, climbed in a twinkling. "The boy next," said Toby. "Hoist him up, I'll catch hold of him." Before Oliver had time to look round, Sikes had caught him under the arms, and in 3 or 4 seconds he and Toby were lying on the grass on the other side. Sikes followed directly. And they stole cautiously towards the house. And now, for the first time, Oliver, well nigh mad with grief and terror, saw that housebreaking and robbery, if not murder, were the objects of the expedition. He clasped his hands together, and involuntarily uttered a subdued exclamation of horror. A mist came before his eyes, the cold sweat stood upon his ashy face, his limbs failed him, and he sank upon his knees. "Get up," murmured Sikes, trembling with rage, and drawing the pistol from his pocket. "Get up, or I'll strew your brains upon the grass." "Oh! For God's sake let me go," cried Oliver, "let me run away and die in the fields. I will never come near London, never, never. Oh! Pray have mercy on me, and do not make me steal. For the love of all the bright angels that rest in heaven, have mercy upon me." The man to whom this appeal was made, swore a dreadful oath, and had cocked the pistol, when Toby, striking it from his grasp, placed his hand upon the boy's mouth, and dragged him to the house. "Hush," cried the man, "it won't answer here. Say another word, and I'll do your business myself with a crack on the head. That makes no noise, and is quite as certain, and more genteel. Here, Bill, wrench the shutter open. He's game enough now, I'll engage. I've seen older hands of his age took the same way, for a minute or two, on a cold night. Sikes, invoking terrific imprecations upon Fagin's head for sending Oliver on such an errand, plied the crowbar vigorously, but with little noise. After some delay, and some assistance from Toby, the shutter to which he had referred, swung open on its hinges. It was a little lattice window, about 5 feet and a half above the ground, at the back of the house, which belonged to a scullery, or small brewing place, at the end of the passage. The aperture was so small, that the inmates had probably not thought it worth while to defend it more securely, but it was large enough to admit a boy of Oliver's size, nevertheless. A very brief exercise of Mr. C.K.'s art, sufficed to overcome the fastening of the lattice, and it soon stood wide open also. "Now listen, you young limb," whispered Sikes, drawing a dark lantern from his pocket, and throwing the glare full on Oliver's face, "I'm a-going to put you through there. Take this light, go softly up the steps straight afore you, and along the little hall, to the street door, unfasten it, and let us in." "There's a bolt at the top, you won't be able to reach," interposed Toby. "Stand upon one of the hall chairs. There are 3 there, Bill, with a jolly large blue unicorn and gold pitchfork on M, which is the old lady's arms." "Keep quiet, can't you?" replied Sikes, with a threatening look. "The room door is open, is it?" "Wide," replied Toby, after peeping in to satisfy himself. "The game of that is, that they always leave it open with a catch, so that the dog, who's got a bed in here, may walk up and down the passage when he feels wakeful." "Ha! Ha! Barney 'ticed him away tonight. So neat." Although Mr. Crackit spoke in a scarcely audible whisper, and laughed without noise, Sikes imperiously commanded him to be silent, and to get to work. Toby complied, by first producing his lantern, and placing it on the ground, then by planting himself firmly with his head against the wall beneath the window, and his hands upon his knees, so as to make a step of his back. This was no sooner done, than Sikes, mounting upon him, put Oliver gently through the window with his feet first, and, without leaving hold of his collar, planted him safely on the floor inside. "Take this lantern," said Sikes, looking into the room. "You see the stairs afore you?" Oliver, more dead than alive, gasped out, "Yes." Sikes, pointing to the street door with the pistol barrel, briefly advised him to take notice that he was within shot all the way, and that if he faltered, he would fall dead that instant. "It's done in a minute," said Sikes, in the same low whisper. "Directly I leave go of you, do your work. Hark!" "What's that?" whispered the other man. They listened intently. "Nothing," said Sikes, releasing his hold of Oliver. Now, in the short time he had had to collect his senses, the boy had firmly resolved that, whether he died in the attempt or not, he would make one effort to dart upstairs from the hall, and alarm the family. Filled with this idea, he advanced at once, but stealthily. "Come back," suddenly cried Sikes aloud. "Back! Back!" Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place, and by a loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall, and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated, a light appeared, a vision of 2 terrified half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes, a flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere, but where he knew not, and he staggered back. Sikes had disappeared for an instant, but he was up again, and had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away. He fired his own pistol after the men, who were already retreating, and dragged the boy up. "Clasp your arm tighter," said Sikes, as he drew him through the window. "Give me a shawl here. They've hit him. Quick! How the boy bleeds!" Then came the loud ringing of a bell, mingled with the noise of firearms, and the shouts of men, and the sensation of being carried over uneven ground at a rapid pace. And then, the noises grew confused in the distance, and a cold deadly feeling crept over the boy's heart, and he saw or heard no more. Chapter 23. Which contains the substance of a pleasant conversation between Mr. Bumble and a lady, and shows that even a beetle may be susceptible on some points. The night was bitter cold. The snow lay on the ground, frozen into a hard thick crust, so that only the heaps that had drifted into byways and corners were affected by the sharp wind that howled abroad, which, as if expending increased fury on such prey as it found, caught it savagely up in clouds, and, whirling it into 1,000 misty eddies, scattered it in air. Bleak, dark, and piercing cold, it was a night for the well-housed and fed to draw around the bright fire and thank God they were at home, and for the homeless, starving wretch to lay him down and die. Many hunger-worn outcasts close their eyes in our bare streets, at such times, who, let their crimes have been what they may, can hardly open them in a more bitter world. Such was the aspect of out-of-doors affairs, when Mrs. Corney, the matron of the workhouse to which our readers have been already introduced as the birthplace of Oliver Twist, sat herself down before a cheerful fire in her own little room, and glanced, with no small degree of complacency, at a small round table, on which stood a tray of corresponding size, furnished with all necessary materials for the most grateful meal that matrons enjoy. In fact, Mrs. Corney was about to solace herself with a cup of tea. As she glanced from the table to the fireplace, where the smallest of all possible kettles was singing a small song in a small voice, her inward satisfaction evidently increased, so much so, indeed, that Mrs. Corney smiled. "Well," said the matron, leaning her elbow on the table, and looking reflectively at the fire, "I'm sure we have all on us a great deal to be grateful for. A great deal, if we did but know it." "Ah!" Mrs. Corney shook her head mournfully, as if deploring the mental blindness of those paupers who did not know it, and thrusting a silver spoon, private property, into the inmost recesses of a 2-ounce tin tea caddy, proceeded to make the tea. "How slight a thing will disturb the equanimity of our frail minds." The black teapot, being very small and easily filled, ran over while Mrs. Corney was moralising, and the water slightly scalded Mrs. Corney's hand. "Drat the pot," said the worthy matron, setting it down very hastily on the hob, "a little stupid thing, that only holds a couple of cups. What use is it of, to anybody? Except," said Mrs. Corney, pausing, "except to a poor desolate creature like me. Oh dear." With these words, the matron dropped into her chair, and, once more resting her elbow on the table, thought of her solitary fate. The small teapot, and the single cup, had awakened in her mind sad recollections of Mr. Corney, who had not been dead more than 25 years, and she was overpowered. "I shall never get another," said Mrs. Corney, pettishly, "I shall never get another, like him." Whether this remark bore reference to the husband, or the teapot, is uncertain. It might have been the latter, for Mrs. Corney looked at it as she spoke, and took it up afterwards. She had just tasted her first cup, when she was disturbed by a soft tap at the room door. "Oh, come in with you," said Mrs. Corney, sharply. "Some of the old women dying, I suppose." "They always die when I'm at meals." "Don't stand there, letting the cold air in, don't." "What's amiss now, eh?" "Nothing, ma'am, nothing," replied a man's voice. "Dear me," exclaimed the matron, in a much sweeter tone, "is that Mr. Bumble?" "At your service, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, who had been stopping outside to rub his shoes clean, and to shake the snow off his coat, and who now made his appearance, bearing the cocked hat in one hand and a bundle in the other. "Shall I shut the door, ma'am?" The lady modestly hesitated to reply, lest there should be any impropriety in holding an interview with Mr. Bumble, with closed doors. Mr. Bumble, taking advantage of the hesitation, and being very cold himself, shut it without permission. "Hard weather, Mr. Bumble," said the matron. Hard, indeed, ma'am, replied the beadle. Antiparochial weather this, ma'am. We have given away, Mrs. Corney, we have given away a matter of 20 quartern loaves and a cheese and a half, this very blessed afternoon, and yet them paupers are not contented. Of course not. When would they be, Mr. Bumble, said the matron, sipping her tea. When, indeed, ma'am, rejoined Mr. Bumble. Why here's one man that, in consideration of his wife and large family, has a quartern loaf and a good pound of cheese, full weight. Is he grateful, ma'am? Is he grateful? Not a copper farthing's worth of it. What does he do, ma'am, but ask for a few coals, if it's only a pocket handkerchief full, he says. Coals. What would he do with coals? Toast his cheese with them and then come back for more. That's the way with these people, ma'am, give them an apron full of coals today, and they'll come back for another, the day after tomorrow, as brazen as alabaster. The matron expressed her entire concurrence in this intelligible simile, and the beadle went on. I never, said Mr. Bumble, see anything like the pitch it's got to. The day afore yesterday, a man, you have been a married woman, ma'am, and I may mention it to you, a man, with hardly a rag upon his back, here Mrs. Corney looked at the floor, goes to our overseer's door when he has got company coming to dinner, and says, he must be relieved, Mrs. Corney. As he wouldn't go away, and shocked the company very much, our overseer sent him out a pound of potatoes and half a pint of oatmeal. My heart, says the ungrateful villain, what's the use of this to me? You might as well give me a pair of iron spectacles. Very good, says our overseer, taking em away again, you won't get anything else here. Then I'll die in the streets, says the vagrant. Oh no, you won't, says our overseer. Ha! Ha! That was very good. So like Mr. Granite, wasn't it? Interposed the matron. Well, Mr. Bumble? Well, ma'am, rejoined the beadle, he went away, and he did die in the streets. There's a obstinate pauper for you. It beats anything I could have believed, observed the matron emphatically. But don't you think out-of-door relief a very bad thing, anyway, Mr. Bumble? You're a gentleman of experience, and ought to know. Come. Mrs. Corney, said the beadle, smiling as men smile who are conscious of superior information, out-of-door relief, properly managed, ma'am, is the parochial safeguard. The great principle of out-of-door relief is, to give the paupers exactly what they don't want, and then they get tired of coming. Dear me, exclaimed Mrs. Corney. Well, that is a good one, too. Yes. Betwixt you and me, ma'am, returned Mr. Bumble, that's the great principle, and that's the reason why, if you look at any cases that get into them audacious newspapers, you'll always observe that sick families have been relieved with slices of cheese. That's the rule now, Mrs. Corney, all over the country. But, however, said the beadle, stopping to unpack his bundle, these are official secrets, ma'am, not to be spoken of, except, as I may say, among the parochial officers, such as ourselves. This is the port wine, ma'am, that the board ordered for the infirmary, real, fresh, genuine port wine, only out of the cask this forenoon, clear as a bell, and no sediment. Having held the first bottle up to the light, and shaken it well to test its excellence, Mr. Bumble placed them both on top of a chest of drawers, folded the handkerchief in which they had been wrapped, put it carefully in his pocket, and took up his hat, as if to go. You'll have a very cold walk, Mr. Bumble, said the matron. It blows, ma'am, replied Mr. Bumble, turning up his coat collar, enough to cut one's ears off. The matron looked, from the little kettle, to the beadle, who was moving towards the door, and as the beadle coughed, preparatory to bidding her good night, bashfully inquired whether he wouldn't take a cup of tea. Mr. Bumble instantaneously turned back his collar again, laid his hat and stick upon a chair, and drew another chair up to the table. As he slowly seated himself, he looked at the lady. She fixed her eyes upon the little teapot. Mr. Bumble coughed again, and slightly smiled. Mrs. Corney rose to get another cup and saucer from the closet. As she sat down, her eyes once again encountered those of the gallant beadle. She colored, and applied herself to the task of making his tea. Again Mr. Bumble coughed, louder this time than he had coughed yet. "Sweet?" "Mr. Bumble?" inquired the matron, taking up the sugar basin. "Very sweet, indeed, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble. He fixed his eyes on Mrs. Corney as he said this, and if ever a beadle looked tender, Mr. Bumble was that beadle at that moment. The tea was made, and handed in silence. Mr. Bumble, having spread a handkerchief over his knees to prevent the crumbs from sullying the splendor of his shorts, began to eat and drink, varying these amusements, occasionally, by fetching a deep sigh, which, however, had no injurious effect upon his appetite, but, on the contrary, rather seemed to facilitate his operations in the tea and toast department. "You have a cat, ma'am, I see," said Mr. Bumble, glancing at one who, in the center of her family, was basking before the fire, "and kittens too, I declare." "I am so fond of them, Mr. Bumble, you can't think," replied the matron. "They're so happy, so frolicsome, and so cheerful, that they are quite companions for me." "Very nice animals, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble, approvingly, "so very domestic." "Oh, yes," rejoined the matron with enthusiasm, "so fond of their home too, that it's quite a pleasure, I'm sure." "Mrs. Corney, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, slowly, and marking the time with his teaspoon, "I mean to say this, ma'am, that any cat, or kitten, that could live with you, ma'am, and not be fond of its home, must be a ass, ma'am." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," remonstrated Mrs. Corney. "It's of no use disguising facts, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, slowly flourishing the teaspoon with a kind of amorous dignity which made him doubly impressive. "I would drown it myself, with pleasure." "Then you're a cruel man," said the matron vivaciously, as she held out her hand for the beadle's cup, "and a very hard-hearted man besides." "Hard-hearted, ma'am?" said Mr. Bumble. "Hard?" Mr. Bumble resigned his cup without another word, squeezed Mrs. Corney's little finger as she took it, and inflicting 2 open-handed slaps upon his laced waistcoat, gave a mighty sigh, and hitched his chair a very little morsel farther from the fire. It was a round table, and as Mrs. Corney and Mr. Bumble had been sitting opposite each other, with no great space between them, and fronting the fire, it will be seen that Mr. Bumble, in receding from the fire, and still keeping at the table, increased the distance between himself and Mrs. Corney, which proceeding, some prudent readers will doubtless be disposed to admire, and to consider an act of great heroism on Mr. Bumble's part, he being in some sort tempted by time, place, and opportunity, to give utterance to certain soft nothings, which however well they may become the lips of the light and thoughtless, do seem immeasurably beneath the dignity of judges of the land, members of Parliament, ministers of state, Lord Mayors, and other great public functionaries, but more particularly beneath the stateliness and gravity of a beadle, who, as is well known, should be the sternest and most inflexible among them all. Whatever were Mr. Bumble's intentions, however, and no doubt they were of the best, it unfortunately happened, as has been twice before remarked, that the table was a round one. Consequently Mr. Bumble, moving his chair by little and little, soon began to diminish the distance between himself and the matron, and, continuing to travel round the outer edge of the circle, brought his chair, in time, close to that in which the matron was seated. Indeed, the 2 chairs touched, and when they did so, Mr. Bumble stopped. Now, if the matron had moved her chair to the right, she would have been scorched by the fire, and if to the left, she must have fallen into Mr. Bumble's arms, so, being a discreet matron, and no doubt foreseeing these consequences at a glance, she remained where she was, and handed Mr. Bumble another cup of tea. "Hard-hearted, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stirring his tea, and looking up into the matron's face, "are you hard-hearted, Mrs. Corney?" "Dear me, exclaimed the matron, what a very curious question from a single man. What can you want to know for, Mr. Bumble? The beadle drank his tea to the last drop, finished a piece of toast, whisked the crumbs off his knees, wiped his lips, and deliberately kissed the matron. Mr. Bumble, cried that discreet lady in a whisper, for the fright was so great, that she had quite lost her voice, Mr. Bumble, I shall scream. Mr. Bumble made no reply, but in a slow and dignified manner, put his arm round the matron's waist. As the lady had stated her intention of screaming, of course she would have screamed at this additional boldness, but that the exertion was rendered unnecessary by a hasty knocking at the door, which was no sooner heard, than Mr. Bumble darted, with much agility, to the wine bottles, and began dusting them with great violence, while the matron sharply demanded who was there. It is worthy of remark, as a curious physical instance of the efficacy of a sudden surprise in counteracting the effects of extreme fear, that her voice had quite recovered all its official asperity. If you please, mistress, said a withered old female pauper, hideously ugly, putting her head in at the door, old Sally is going fast. Well, what's that to me? Angrily demanded the matron. I can't keep her alive, can I? No, no, mistress, replied the old woman, nobody can, she's far beyond the reach of help. I've seen a many people die, little babes and great strong men, and I know when death's coming, well enough. But she's troubled in her mind, and when the fits are not on her, and that's not often, for she is dying very hard, she says she has got something to tell, which you must hear. She'll never die quiet till you come, mistress. At this intelligence, the worthy Mrs. Corney muttered a variety of invectives against old women who couldn't even die without purposely annoying their betters, and, muffling herself in a thick shawl which she hastily caught up, briefly requested Mr. Bumble to stay till she came back, lest anything particular should occur. Bidding the messenger walk fast, and not be all night hobbling up the stairs, she followed her from the room with a very ill grace, scolding all the way. Mr. Bumble's conduct on being left to himself, was rather inexplicable. He opened the closet, counted the teaspoons, weighed the sugar tongs, closely inspected a silver milk pot to ascertain that it was of the genuine metal, and, having satisfied his curiosity on these points, put on his cocked hat cornerwise, and danced with much gravity for distinct times round the table. Having gone through this very extraordinary performance, he took off the cocked hat again, and, spreading himself before the fire with his back towards it, seemed to be mentally engaged in taking an exact inventory of the furniture. Chapter 24 treats on a very poor subject, but is a short one, and may be found of importance in this history. It was no unfit messenger of death, who had disturbed the quiet of the matron's room. Her body was bent by age, her limbs trembled with palsy, her face, distorted into a mumbling leer, resembled more the grotesque shaping of some wild pencil, than the work of nature's hand. Alas! How few of nature's faces are left alone to gladden us with their beauty. The cares, and sorrows, and hungerings, of the world, change them as they change hearts, and it is only when those passions sleep, and have lost their hold forever, that the troubled clouds pass off and leave heaven's surface clear. It is a common thing for the countenances of the dead, even in that fixed and rigid state, to subside into the long-forgotten expression of sleeping infancy, and settle into the very look of early life, so calm, so peaceful, do they grow again, that those who knew them in their happy childhood, kneel by the coffin's side in awe, and see the angel even upon earth. The old crone tottered along the passages, and up the stairs, muttering some indistinct answers to the chidings of her companion. Being at length compelled to pause for breath, she gave the light into her hand, and remained behind to follow as she might, while the more nimble superior made her way to the room where the sick woman lay. It was a bare garret room, with a dim light burning at the farther end. There was another old woman watching by the bed, the parish apothecary's apprentice was standing by the fire, making a toothpick out of a quill. "Cold night, Mrs. Corney," said this young gentleman, as the matron entered. "Very cold, indeed, sir," replied the mistress, in her most civil tones, and dropping a curtsy as she spoke. "You should get better coals out of your contractors," said the apothecary's deputy, breaking a lump on the top of the fire with the rusty poker. "These are not at all the sort of thing for a cold night." "They're the board's choosing, sir," returned the matron. "The least they could do, would be to keep us pretty warm, for our places are hard enough." The conversation was here interrupted by a moan from the sick woman. "Oh," said the young man, turning his face towards the bed, as if he had previously quite forgotten the patient, "it's all up there, Mrs. Corney." "It is it, sir?" asked the matron. "If she lasts a couple of hours, I shall be surprised," said the apothecary's apprentice, intent upon the toothpick's point. "It's a break-up of the system altogether." "Is she dozing, old lady?" The attendant stooped over the bed, to ascertain, and nodded in the affirmative. "Then perhaps she'll go off in that way, if you don't make a row," said the young man. "Put the light on the floor. She won't see it there." The attendant did as she was told, shaking her head meanwhile, to intimate that the woman would not die so easily. Having done so, she resumed her seat by the side of the other nurse, who had by this time returned. The mistress, with an expression of impatience, wrapped herself in her shawl, and sat at the foot of the bed. The apothecary's apprentice, having completed the manufacture of the toothpick, planted himself in front of the fire and made good use of it for 10 minutes or so, when apparently growing rather dull, he wished Mrs. Corney joy of her job, and took himself off on tiptoe. When they had sat in silence for some time, the two old women rose from the bed, and crouching over the fire, held out their withered hands to catch the heat. The flame threw a ghastly light on their shriveled faces, and made their ugliness appear terrible, as, in this position, they began to converse in a low voice. "Did she say any more, Annie dear, while I was gone?" inquired the messenger. "Not a word," replied the other. "She plucked and tore at her arms for a little time, but I held her hands, and she soon dropped off. She hasn't much strength in her, so I easily kept her quiet. I ain't so weak for an old woman, although I am on parish allowance, no, no." "Did she drink the hot wine the doctor said she was to have?" demanded the first. "I tried to get it down," rejoined the other. "But her teeth were tight set, and she clenched the mug so hard that it was as much as I could do to get it back again. So I drank it, and it did me good." Looking cautiously round, to ascertain that they were not overheard, the two hags cowered nearer to the fire, and chuckled heartily. "I mind the time," said the first speaker, "when she would have done the same, and made rare fun of it afterwards." "Aye, that she would," rejoined the other, "she had a merry heart. A many, many, beautiful corpses she laid out, as nice and neat as waxwork. My old eyes have seen them, aye, and those old hands touched them too, for I have helped her, scores of times." Stretching forth her trembling fingers as she spoke, the old creature shook them exultingly before her face, and fumbling in her pocket, brought out an old-time discolored tin snuff-box, from which she shook a few grains into the outstretched palm of her companion, and a few more into her own. While they were thus employed, the matron, who had been impatiently watching until the dying woman should awaken from her stupor, joined them by the fire, and sharply asked how long she was to wait. "Not long, mistress," replied the second woman, looking up into her face. "We have none of us long to wait for death. Patience, patience. He'll be here soon enough for us all." "Hold your tongue, you doting idiot," said the matron sternly. "You, Martha, tell me, has she been in this way before?" "Often," answered the first woman. "But will never be again," added the second one, "that is, she'll never wake again but once, and mind, mistress, that won't be for long." "Long or short," said the matron, snappishly, "she won't find me here when she does wake. Take care, both of you, how you worry me again for nothing. It's no part of my duty to see all the old women in the house die, and I won't, that's more. Mind that, you impudent old harridans." If you make a fool of me again, I'll soon cure you, I warrant you. She was bouncing away, when a cry from the two women, who had turned towards the bed, caused her to look round. The patient had raised herself upright, and was stretching her arms towards them. "Who's that?" she cried, in a hollow voice. "Hush, hush," said one of the women, stooping over her. "Lie down, lie down." "I'll never lie down again alive," said the woman, struggling. "I will tell her. Come here. Nearer. Let me whisper in your ear." She clutched the matron by the arm, and forcing her into a chair by the bedside, was about to speak, when looking round, she caught sight of the two old women bending forward in the attitude of eager listeners. "Turn them away," said the woman, drowsily, "make haste. Make haste." The two old crones, chiming in together, began pouring out many piteous lamentations that the poor dear was too far gone to know her best friends, and were uttering sundry protestations that they would never leave her, when the superior pushed them from the room, closed the door, and returned to the bedside. On being excluded, the old ladies changed their tone, and cried through the keyhole that old Sally was drunk, which, indeed, was not unlikely, since, in addition to a moderate dose of opium prescribed by the apothecary, she was laboring under the effects of a final taste of gin and water which had been privily administered, in the openness of their hearts, by the worthy old ladies themselves. "Now listen to me," said the dying woman aloud, as if making a great effort to revive one latent spark of energy. "In this very room, in this very bed, I once nursed a pretty young creature, that was brought into the house with her feet cut and bruised with walking, and all soiled with dust and blood. She gave birth to a boy, and died. Let me think, what was the year again?" "Never mind the year," said the impatient auditor, "what about her?" "Ay," murmured the sick woman, relapsing into her former drowsy state, "what about her, what about, I know," she cried, jumping fiercely up, her face flushed, and her eyes starting from her head, "I robbed her, so I did. She wasn't cold, I tell you she wasn't cold, when I stole it." "Stole what, for God's sake?" cried the matron, with a gesture as if she would call for help. "It," replied the woman, laying her hand over the other's mouth. "The only thing she had. She wanted clothes to keep her warm, and food to eat, but she had kept it safe, and had it in her bosom. It was gold, I tell you. Rich gold, that might have saved her life." "Gold," echoed the matron, bending eagerly over the woman as she fell back. Go on, yes, what of it? Who was the mother? When was it?" "She charged me to keep it safe," replied the woman with a groan, "and trusted me as the only woman about her. I stole it in my heart when she first showed it me hanging round her neck, and the child's death, perhaps, is on me besides. They would have treated him better, if they had known it all." "Known what?" asked the other. "Speak." "The boy grew so like his mother," said the woman, rambling on, and not heeding the question, "that I could never forget it when I saw his face. Poor girl! Poor girl! She was so young, too. Such a gentle lamb. Wait, there's more to tell. I have not told you all, have I?" "No, no," replied the matron, inclining her head to catch the words, as they came more faintly from the dying woman. "Be quick, or it may be too late." "The mother," said the woman, making a more violent effort than before, "the mother, when the pains of death first came upon her, whispered in my ear that if her baby was born alive, and thrived, the day might come when it would not feel so much disgrace to hear its poor young mother named. And oh, kind heaven, she said, folding her thin hands together, whether it be boy or girl, raise up some friends for it in this troubled world, and take pity upon a lonely desolate child, abandoned to its mercy." "The boy's name?" demanded the matron. "They called him Oliver," replied the woman, feebly. "The gold I stole was—" "Yes, yes, what?" cried the other. She was bending eagerly over the woman to hear her reply, but drew back, instinctively, as she once again rose, slowly and stiffly, into a sitting posture, then, clutching the coverlid with both hands, muttered some indistinct sounds in her throat, and fell lifeless on the bed. "Stone dead," said one of the old women, hurrying in as soon as the door was opened. "And nothing to tell, after all," rejoined the matron, walking carelessly away. The two crones, to all appearance, too busily occupied in the preparations for their dreadful duties to make any reply, were left alone, hovering about the body. Chapter 25. Wherein this history reverts to Mr. Fagin and Company. While these things were passing in the country workhouse, Mr. Fagin sat in the old den, the same from which Oliver had been removed by the girl, brooding over a dull, smoky fire. He held a pair of bellows upon his knee, with which he had apparently been endeavoring to rouse it into more cheerful action, but he had fallen into deep thought, and with his arms folded on them, and his chin resting on his thumbs, fixed his eyes, abstractedly, on the rusty bars. At a table behind him sat the artful Dodger, Master Charles Bates, and Mr. Chitlin, all intent upon a game of whist, the artful taking dummy against Master Bates and Mr. Chitlin. The countenance of the first-named gentleman, peculiarly intelligent at all times, acquired great additional interest from his close observance of the game, and his attentive perusal of Mr. Chitlin's hand, upon which, from time to time, as occasion served, he bestowed a variety of earnest glances, wisely regulating his own play by the result of his observations upon his neighbor's cards. It being a cold night, the Dodger wore his hat, as, indeed, was often his custom within doors. He also sustained a clay pipe between his teeth, which he only removed for a brief space when he deemed it necessary to apply for refreshment to a quart pot upon the table, which stood ready filled with gin and water for the accommodation of the company. Master Bates was also attentive to the play, but being of a more excitable nature than his accomplished friend, it was observable that he more frequently applied himself to the gin and water, and moreover indulged in many jests and irrelevant remarks, all highly unbecoming a scientific rubber. Indeed, the artful, presuming upon their close attachment, more than once took occasion to reason gravely with his companion upon these improprieties, all of which remonstrances, Master Bates received in extremely good part, merely requesting his friend to be blowed, or to insert his head in a sack, or replying with some other neatly turned witticism of a similar kind, the happy application of which excited considerable admiration in the mind of Mr. Chitlin. It was remarkable that the latter gentleman and his partner invariably lost, and that the circumstance, so far from angering Master Bates, appeared to afford him the highest amusement, inasmuch as he laughed most uproariously at the end of every deal, and protested that he had never seen such a jolly game in all his born days. "That's 2 doubles in the rub," said Mr. Chitlin, with a very long face, as he drew half a crown from his waistcoat pocket. "I never see such a feller as you, Jack, you win everything. Even when we've good cards, Charlie and I can't make nothing of 'em." Either the matter or the manner of this remark, which was made very ruefully, delighted Charlie Bates so much, that his consequent shout of laughter roused the Jew from his reverie, and induced him to inquire what was the matter. "Matter, Fagin," cried Charlie. "I wish you had watched the play. Tommy Chitlin hasn't won a point, and I went partners with him against the artful and dumb." "I," said the Jew, with a grin, which sufficiently demonstrated that he was at no loss to understand the reason. "Try 'em again, Tom, try 'em again." "No more of it for me, thank ye, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitlin, "I've had enough. That 'ere Dodger has such a run of luck that there's no standing again him." "Ha! Ha! My dear," replied the Jew, "you must get up very early in the morning, to win against the Dodger." "Morning," said Charlie Bates, "you must put your boots on overnight, and have a telescope at each eye, and a opera glass between your shoulders, if you want to come over him." Mr. Dawkins received these handsome compliments with much philosophy, and offered to cut any gentleman in company, for the first picture card, at a shilling at a time. Nobody accepting the challenge, and his pipe being by this time smoked out, he proceeded to amuse himself by sketching a ground plan of Newgate on the table with the piece of chalk which had served him in lieu of counters, whistling, meantime, with peculiar shrillness. "How precious dull you are, Tommy," said the Dodger, stopping short when there had been a long silence, and addressing Mr. Chitlin. "What do you think he's thinking of, Fagin?" "How should I know, my dear," replied the Jew, looking round as he plied the bellows. "About his losses, maybe, or the little retirement in the country that he's just left, eh? Ha! Ha! Is that it, my dear?" "Not a bit of it," replied the Dodger, stopping the subject of discourse as Mr. Chitlin was about to reply. "What do you say, Charlie?" "I should say," replied Master Bates, with a grin, "that he was uncommon sweet upon Betsy. See how he's blushing. Oh, my eye! Here's a merry-go-rounder. Tommy Chitlin's in love. Oh, Fagin, Fagin! What a spree!" Thoroughly overpowered with the notion of Mr. Chitlin being the victim of the tender passion, Master Bates threw himself back in his chair with such violence, that he lost his balance, and pitched over upon the floor, where, the accident abating nothing of his merriment, he lay at full length until his laugh was over, when he resumed his former position, and began another laugh. "Never mind him, my dear," said the Jew, winking at Mr. Dawkins, and giving Master Bates a reproving tap with the nozzle of the bellows. "Betsy's a fine girl. Stick up to her, Tom. Stick up to her." "What I mean to say, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitlin, very red in the face, "is, that isn't anything to anybody here." "No more it is," replied the Jew, "Charlie will talk. Don't mind him, my dear, don't mind him. Betsy's a fine girl. Do as she bids you, Tom, and you will make your fortune." "So I do as she bids me," replied Mr. Chitlin. "I shouldn't have been milled, if it hadn't been for her advice. But it turned out a good job for you, didn't it, Fagin? And what's 6 weeks of it? It must come, some time or another, and why not in the winter time when you don't want to go out walking so much, Fagin?" "Ah, to be sure, my dear," replied the Jew. "You wouldn't mind it again, Tom, would you?" asked the Dodger, winking upon Charlie and the Jew, "if Bet was all right?" "I mean to say that I shouldn't," replied Tom, angrily. "There, now. Ah! Who'll say as much as that, I should like to know, Fagin?" "Nobody, my dear," replied the Jew, "not a soul, Tom. I don't know one of 'em that would do it besides you, not one of 'em, my dear. I might have got clear off, if I'd split upon her, mightn't I, Fagin?" angrily pursued the poor half-witted dupe. "A word from me would have done it, wouldn't it, Fagin?" "To be sure it would, my dear," replied the Jew. "But I didn't blab it, did I, Fagin?" demanded Tom, pouring question upon question with great volubility. "No, to be sure," replied the Jew, "you were too stout-hearted for that. A deal too stout, my dear." "Perhaps I was," rejoined Tom, looking round, "and if I was, what's to laugh at, in that, Fagin?" The Jew, perceiving that Mr. Chitlin was considerably roused, hastened to assure him that nobody was laughing, and to prove the gravity of the company, appealed to Master Bates, the principal offender. But, unfortunately, Charlie, in opening his mouth to reply that he was never more serious in his life, was unable to prevent the escape of such a violent roar, that the abused Mr. Chitlin, without any preliminary ceremonies, rushed across the room and aimed a blow at the offender, who, being skillful in evading pursuit, ducked to avoid it, and chose his time so well that it lighted on the chest of the merry old gentleman, and caused him to stagger to the wall, where he stood panting for breath. While Mr. Chitlin looked on in intense dismay. "Hark!" cried the Dodger at this moment, "I heard the tinkler." Catching up the light, he crept softly upstairs. The bell was rung again, with some impatience, while the party were in darkness. After a short pause, the Dodger reappeared, and whispered Fagin mysteriously. "What?" cried the Jew, alone. The Dodger nodded in the affirmative, and, shading the flame of the candle with his hand, gave Charlie Bates a private intimation, in dumb show, that he had better not be funny just then. Having performed this friendly office, he fixed his eyes on the Jew's face, and awaited his directions. The old man bit his yellow fingers, and meditated for some seconds, his face working with agitation the while, as if he dreaded something, and feared to know the worst. At length he raised his head. "Where is he?" he asked. The Dodger pointed to the floor above, and made a gesture, as if to leave the room. "Yes," said the Jew, answering the mute inquiry, "bring him down." "Hush! Quiet, Charlie. Gently, Tom. Scarce." This brief direction to Charlie Bates and his recent antagonist, was softly and immediately obeyed. There was no sound of their whereabout, when the Dodger descended the stairs, bearing the light in his hand, and followed by a man in a coarse smock-frock, who, after casting a hurried glance round the room, pulled off a large wrapper which had concealed the lower portion of his face, and disclosed, all haggard, unwashed, and unshorn, the features of Flash Toby Crackit. "How are you, Faggy?" said this worthy, nodding to the Jew. "Pop that shawl away in my castor, Dodger, so that I may know where to find it when I cut, that's the time of day. You'll be a fine young cracksman afore the old file now." With these words he pulled up the smock-frock, and, winding it round his middle, drew a chair to the fire, and placed his feet upon the hob. "See there, Faggy," he said, pointing disconsolately to his top boots, "not a drop of day in Martin since you know when, not a bubble of blacking, by Jove. But don't look at me in that way, man. All in good time. I can't talk about business till I've eat and drank, so produce the sustenance, and let's have a quiet fill-out for the first time these 3 days." The Jew motioned to the Dodger to place what eatables there were, upon the table, and, seating himself opposite the housebreaker, waited his leisure. To judge from appearances, Toby was by no means in a hurry to open the conversation. At first, the Jew contented himself with patiently watching his countenance, as if to gain from its expression some clue to the intelligence he brought, but in vain. He looked tired and worn, but there was the same complacent repose upon his features that they always wore, and through dirt, and beard, and whisker, there still shone, unimpaired, the self-satisfied smirk of Flash Toby Crackit. Then the Jew, in an agony of impatience, watched every morsel he put into his mouth, pacing up and down the room, meanwhile, in irrepressible excitement. It was all of no use. Toby continued to eat with the utmost outward indifference, until he could eat no more, then, ordering the Dodger out, he closed the door, mixed a glass of spirits and water, and composed himself for talking. "First and foremost, Faggy," said Toby. "Yes, interposed the Jew, drawing up his chair. Mr. Crackit stopped to take a draught of spirits and water, and to declare that the gin was excellent, then placing his feet against the low mantelpiece, so as to bring his boots to about the level of his eye, he quietly resumed. "First and foremost, Faggy," said the housebreaker, "how's Bill?" "What?" screamed the Jew, starting from his seat. "Why, you don't mean to say," began Toby, turning pale. "Mean," cried the Jew, stamping furiously on the ground. "Where are they? Sykes and the boy. Where are they? Where have they been? Where are they hiding? Why have they not been here?" "The crack failed," said Toby faintly. "I know it," replied the Jew, tearing a newspaper from his pocket and pointing to it. "What more?" "They fired and hit the boy. We cut over the fields at the back, with him between us, straight as the crow flies, through hedge and ditch. They gave chase. Damn! The whole country was awake, and the dogs upon us. The boy. Bill had him on his back, and scud like the wind. We stopped to take him between us, his head hung down, and he was cold. They were close upon our heels, every man for himself, and each from the gallows. We parted company, and left the youngster lying in a ditch. Alive or dead, that's all I know about him. The Jew stopped to hear no more, but uttering a loud yell, and twining his hands in his hair, rushed from the room, and from the house. Chapter 26. In which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things, inseparable from this history, are done and performed. The old man had gained the street corner, before he began to recover the effect of Toby Crackett's intelligence. He had relaxed nothing of his unusual speed, but was still pressing onward, in the same wild and disordered manner, when the sudden dashing past of a carriage, and a boisterous cry from the foot passengers, who saw his danger, drove him back upon the pavement. Avoiding, as much as was possible, all the main streets, and skulking only through the byways and alleys, he at length emerged on Snow Hill. Here he walked even faster than before, nor did he linger until he had again turned into a court, when, as if conscious that he was now in his proper element, he fell into his usual shuffling pace, and seemed to breathe more freely. Near to the spot on which Snow Hill and Holborn Hill meet, opens, upon the right hand as you come out of the city, a narrow and dismal alley, leading to Saffron Hill. In its filthy shops are exposed for sale huge bunches of second-hand silk handkerchiefs, of all sizes and patterns, for here reside the traders who purchase them from pickpockets. Hundreds of these handkerchiefs hang dangling from pegs outside the windows or flaunting from the doorposts, and the shelves, within, are piled with them. Confined as the limits of Field Lane are, it has its barber, its coffee shop, its beer shop, and its fried fish warehouse. It is a commercial colony of itself, the emporium of petty larceny, visited at early morning, and setting in of dusk, by silent merchants, who traffic in dark back parlors, and who go as strangely as they come. Here, the clothes man, the shoe vamper, and the rag merchant, display their goods, as signboards to the petty thief. Here, stores of old iron and bones, and heaps of mildewy fragments of woolen stuff and linen, rust and rot in the grimy cellars. It was into this place that the Jew turned. He was well known to the sallow denizens of the lane, for such of them as were on the lookout to buy or sell, nodded, familiarly, as he passed along. He replied to their salutations in the same way, but bestowed no closer recognition until he reached the further end of the alley, when he stopped, to address a salesman of small stature, who had squeezed as much of his person into a child's chair as the chair would hold, and was smoking a pipe at his warehouse door. "Why, the sight of you, Mr. Fagin, would cure the hoptalmy," said this respectable trader, in acknowledgment of the Jew's inquiry after his health. "The neighborhood was a little too hot, lively," said Fagin, elevating his eyebrows, and crossing his hands upon his shoulders. "Well, I've heard that complaint of it, once or twice before," replied the trader, "but it soon cools down again, don't you find it so?" Fagin nodded in the affirmative. Pointing in the direction of Saffron Hill, he inquired whether anyone was up yonder tonight. "At the Cripples?" inquired the man. The Jew nodded. "Let me see," pursued the merchant, reflecting. "Yes, there's some half-dozen of 'em gone in, that I knows. I don't think your friend's there." "Sykes is not, I suppose?" inquired the Jew, with a disappointed countenance. "Non estuentis, as the lawyers say," replied the little man, shaking his head, and looking amazingly sly. "Have you got anything in my line tonight?" "Nothing tonight," said the Jew, turning away. "Are you going up to the Cripples, Fagin?" cried the little man, calling after him. "Stop. I don't mind if I have a drop there with you." But as the Jew, looking back, waved his hand to intimate that he preferred being alone, and, moreover, as the little man could not very easily disengage himself from the chair, the sign of the Cripples was, for a time, bereft of the advantage of Mr. Lively's presence. By the time he had got upon his legs, the Jew had disappeared, so Mr. Lively, after ineffectually standing on tiptoe, in the hope of catching sight of him, again forced himself into the little chair, and, exchanging a shake of the head with a lady in the opposite shop, in which doubt and mistrust were plainly mingled, resumed his pipe with a grave demeanour. The Three Cripples, or rather the Cripples, which was the sign by which the establishment was familiarly known to its patrons, was the public-house in which Mr. Sikes and his dog have already figured. Merely making a sign to a man at the bar, Fagin walked straight upstairs, and opening the door of a room, and softly insinuating himself into the chamber, looked anxiously about, shading his eyes with his hand, as if in search of some particular person. The room was illuminated by 2 gas-lights, the glare of which was prevented by the barred shutters, and closely drawn curtains of faded red, from being visible outside. The ceiling was blackened, to prevent its color from being injured by the flaring of the lamps, and the place was so full of dense tobacco smoke, that at first it was scarcely possible to discern anything more. By degrees, however, as some of it cleared away through the open door, an assemblage of heads, as confused as the noises that greeted the ear, might be made out, and as the eye grew more accustomed to the scene, the spectator gradually became aware of the presence of a numerous company, male and female, crowded round a long table, at the upper end of which sat a chairman with a hammer of office in his hand, while a professional gentleman with a bluish nose, and his face tied up for the benefit of a toothache, presided at a jingling piano in a remote corner. As Fagin stepped softly in, the professional gentleman, running over the keys by way of prelude, occasioned a general cry of order for a song, which having subsided, a young lady proceeded to entertain the company with a ballad in 4 verses, between each of which the accompanist played the melody all through, as loud as he could. When this was over, the chairman gave a sentiment, after which, the professional gentleman on the chairman's right and left volunteered a duet, and sang it, with great applause. It was curious to observe some faces which stood out prominently from among the group. There was the chairman himself, the landlord of the house, a coarse, rough, heavy-built fellow, who, while the songs were proceeding, rolled his eyes hither and thither, and, seeming to give himself up to joviality, had an eye for everything that was done, and an ear for everything that was said, and sharp ones, too. Near him were the singers, receiving, with professional indifference, the compliments of the company, and applying themselves, in turn, to a dozen proffered glasses of spirits and water, tendered by their more boisterous admirers, whose countenances, expressive of almost every vice in almost every grade, irresistibly attracted the attention, by their very repulsiveness. Cunning, ferocity, and drunkenness in all its stages, were there, in their strongest aspect, and women, some with the last lingering tinge of their early freshness almost fading as you looked, others with every mark and stamp of their sex utterly beaten out, and presenting but one loathsome blank of profligacy and crime, some mere girls, others but young women, and none past the prime of life, formed the darkest and saddest portion of this dreary picture. Fagin, troubled by no grave emotions, looked eagerly from face to face while these proceedings were in progress, but apparently without meeting that of which he was in search. Succeeding, at length, in catching the eye of the man who occupied the chair, he beckoned to him slightly, and left the room, as quietly as he had entered it. "What can I do for you, Mr. Fagin?" inquired the man, as he followed him out to the landing. "Won't you join us?" "They'll be delighted, every one of 'em." The Jew shook his head impatiently, and said in a whisper, "Is he here?" "No," replied the man. "And no news of Barney?" inquired Fagin. "None," replied the landlord of the Cripples, for it was he. "He won't stir till it's all safe. Depend on it, they're on the scent down there, and that if he moved, he'd blow upon the thing at once. He's all right enough, Barney is, else I should have heard of him. I'll pound it, that Barney's managing properly. Let him alone for that." "Will he be here tonight?" asked the Jew, laying the same emphasis on the pronoun as before. "Monks, do you mean?" inquired the landlord, hesitating. Hush, said the Jew. Yes. Certain, replied the man, drawing a gold watch from his fob, I expected him here before now. If you'll wait 10 minutes, he'll be. No, no, said the Jew, hastily, as though, however desirous he might be to see the person in question, he was nevertheless relieved by his absence. Tell him I came here to see him, and that he must come to me tonight. No, say tomorrow. As he is not here, tomorrow will be time enough. Good, said the man. Nothing more. Not a word now, said the Jew, descending the stairs. I say, said the other, looking over the rails, and speaking in a hoarse whisper, what a time this would be for a cell. I've got Phil Barker here, so drunk, that a boy might take him. Ah! But it's not Phil Barker's time, said the Jew, looking up. Phil has something more to do, before we can afford to part with him, so go back to the company, my dear, and tell them to lead merry lives, while they last. Ha! 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 The landlord reciprocated the old man's laugh, and returned to his guests. The Jew was no sooner alone, than his countenance resumed its former expression of anxiety and thought. After a brief reflection, he called a hack cabriolet, and bade the man drive towards Bethnal Green. He dismissed him within some quarter of a mile of Mr. Sykes's residence, and performed the short remainder of the distance on foot. Now, muttered the Jew, as he knocked at the door, if there is any deep play here, I shall have it out of you, my girl, cunning as you are. She was in her room, the woman said. Fagin crept softly upstairs, and entered it without any previous ceremony. The girl was alone, lying with her head upon the table, and her hair straggling over it. She has been drinking, thought the Jew, coolly, or perhaps she is only miserable. The old man turned to close the door. As he made this reflection, the noise thus occasioned, roused the girl. She eyed his crafty face narrowly, as she inquired to his recital of Toby Crackett's story. When it was concluded, she sank into her former attitude, but spoke not a word. She pushed the candle impatiently away, and once or twice as she feverishly changed her position, shuffled her feet upon the ground, but this was all. During the silence, the Jew looked restlessly about the room, as if to assure himself that there were no appearances of Sykes having covertly returned. Apparently satisfied with his inspection, he coughed twice or thrice, and made as many efforts to open a conversation, but the girl heeded him no more than if he had been made of stone. At length he made another attempt, and rubbing his hands together, said, in his most conciliatory tone, "And where should you think Bill was now, my dear?" The girl moaned out some half-intelligible reply, that she could not tell, and seemed, from the smothered noise that escaped her, to be crying. "And the boy, too," said the Jew, straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of her face. "Poor little child. Left in a ditch, Nance, only think." "The child," said the girl, suddenly looking up, "is better where he is, than among us, and if no harm comes to Bill from it, I hope he lies dead in the ditch and that his young bones may rot there." "What?" cried the Jew, in amazement. I do," returned the girl, meeting his gaze. "I shall be glad to have him away from my eyes, and to know that the worst is over. I can't bear to have him about me. The sight of him turns me against myself, and all of you." "Pooh," said the Jew, scornfully. "You're drunk." "Am I?" cried the girl bitterly. "It's no fault of yours, if I am not. You'd never have me anything else, if you had your will, except now. The humor doesn't suit you, doesn't it?" "No," rejoined the Jew, furiously. "It does not." "Change it, then," responded the girl, with a laugh. "Change it," exclaimed the Jew, exasperated beyond all bounds by his companion's unexpected obstinacy, and the vexation of the night, "I will change it. Listen to me, you drab. Listen to me, who with 6 words, can strangle Sikes as surely as if I had his bull's throat between my fingers now. If he comes back, and leaves the boy behind him, if he gets off free, and dead or alive, fails to restore him to me, murder him yourself if you would have him escape Jack Ketch. And do it the moment he sets foot in this room, or mind me, it will be too late." "What is all this?" cried the girl involuntarily. "What is it?" pursued Fagin, mad with rage. "When the boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me, am I to lose what chance threw me in the way of getting safely, through the whims of a drunken gang that I could whistle away the lives of? And me bound, too, to a born devil that only wants the will, and has the power to. Panting for breath, the old man stammered for a word, and in that instant checked the torrent of his wrath, and changed his whole demeanor. A moment before, his clenched hands had grasped the air, his eyes had dilated, and his face grown livid with passion, but now, he shrunk into a chair, and, cowering together, trembled with the apprehension of having himself disclosed some hidden villainy. After a short silence, he ventured to look round at his companion. He appeared somewhat reassured, on beholding her in the same listless attitude from which he had first roused her. "Nancy, dear," croaked the Jew, in his usual voice. "Did you mind me, dear?" "Don't worry me now, Fagin," replied the girl, raising her head languidly. "If Bill has not done it this time, he will another. He has done many a good job for you, and will do many more when he can, and when he can't he won't, so no more about that. Regarding this boy, my dear," said the Jew, rubbing the palms of his hands nervously together. "The boy must take his chance with the rest," interrupted Nancy, hastily, "and I say again, I hope he is dead, and out of harm's way, and out of yours, that is, if Bill comes to no harm. And if Toby got clear off, Bill's pretty sure to be safe, for Bill's worth two of Toby any time. And about what I was saying, my dear," observed the Jew, keeping his glistening eye steadily upon her. "You must say it all over again, if it's anything you want me to do," rejoined Nancy, "and if it is, you had better wait till tomorrow. You put me up for a minute, but now I'm stupid again." Fagin put several other questions, all with the same drift of ascertaining whether the girl had profited by his unguarded hints, but she answered them so readily, and was withal so utterly unmoved by his searching looks, that his original impression of her being more than a trifle in liquor, was confirmed. Nancy, indeed, was not exempt from a failing which was very common among the Jew's female pupils, and in which, in their tenderer years, they were rather encouraged than checked. Her disordered appearance, and a wholesale perfume of Geneva which pervaded the apartment, afforded strong confirmatory evidence of the justice of the Jew's supposition, and when, after indulging in the temporary display of violence above described, she subsided, first into dullness, and afterwards into a compound of feelings, under the influence of which she shed tears 1 minute, and in the next gave utterance to various exclamations of "never say die," and divers calculations as to what might be the amount of the odds so long as a lady or gentleman was happy. Mr. Fagin, who had had considerable experience of such matters in his time, saw, with great satisfaction, that she was very far gone indeed. Having eased his mind by this discovery, and having accomplished his twofold object of imparting to the girl what he had, that night, heard, and of ascertaining, with his own eyes, that Sikes had not returned, Mr. Fagin again turned his face homeward, leaving his young friend asleep, with her head upon the table. It was within an hour of midnight. The weather being dark, and piercing cold, he had no great temptation to loiter. The sharp wind that scoured the streets, seemed to have cleared them of passengers, as of dust and mud, for few people were abroad, and they were to all appearance hastening fast home. It blew from the right quarter for the Jew, however, and straight before it he went, trembling, and shivering, as every fresh gust drove him rudely on his way. He had reached the corner of his own street, and was already fumbling in his pocket for the door key, when a dark figure emerged from a projecting entrance which lay in deep shadow, and, crossing the road, glided up to him unperceived. Fagin, whispered a voice close to his ear. Ah, said the Jew, turning quickly round, is that? Yes, interrupted the stranger. I have been lingering here these 2 hours. Where the devil have you been? On your business, my dear, replied the Jew, glancing uneasily at his companion, and slackening his pace as he spoke. On your business all night. Oh, of course, said the stranger, with a sneer. Well, and what's come of it? Nothing good, said the Jew. Nothing bad, I hope, said the stranger, stopping short, and turning a startled look on his companion. The Jew shook his head, and was about to reply, when the stranger, interrupting him, motioned to the house, before which they had by this time arrived, remarking, that he had better say what he had got to say, under cover, for his blood was chilled with standing about so long, and the wind blew through him. Fagin looked as if he could have willingly excused himself from taking home a visitor at that unseasonable hour, and, indeed, muttered something about having no fire, but his companion repeating his request in a peremptory manner, he unlocked the door, and requested him to close it softly, while he got a light. It's as dark as the grave, said the man, groping forward a few steps. Make haste. Shut the door, whispered Fagin from the end of the passage. As he spoke, it closed with a loud noise. That wasn't my doing, said the other man, feeling his way. The wind blew it to, or it shut of its own accord, one or the other. Look sharp with the light, or I shall knock my brains out against something in this confounded hole. Fagin stealthily descended the kitchen stairs. After a short absence, he returned with a lighted candle, and the intelligence that Toby Crackit was asleep in the back room below, and that the boys were in the front one. Beckoning the man to follow him, he led the way upstairs. We can say the few words we've got to say in here, my dear, said the Jew, throwing open a door on the first floor, and as there are holes in the shutters, and we never show lights to our neighbors, we'll set the candle on the stairs. There. With those words, the Jew, stooping down, placed the candle on an upper flight of stairs, exactly opposite to the room door. This done, he led the way into the apartment, which was destitute of all movables save a broken armchair, and an old couch or sofa without covering, which stood behind the door. Upon this piece of furniture, the stranger sat himself with the air of a weary man, and the Jew, drawing up the armchair opposite, they sat face to face. It was not quite dark, the door was partially open, and the candle outside, threw a feeble reflection on the opposite wall. They conversed for some time in whispers. Though nothing of the conversation was distinguishable beyond a few disjointed words here and there, a listener might easily have perceived that Fagin appeared to be defending himself against some remarks of the stranger, and that the latter was in a state of considerable irritation. They might have been talking, thus, for a quarter of an hour or more, when Monks, by which name the Jew had designated the strange man several times in the course of their colloquy, said, raising his voice a little. I tell you again, it was badly planned. Why not have kept him here among the rest, and made a sneaking, snivelling pickpocket of him at once? Only hear him, exclaimed the Jew, shrugging his shoulders. Why, do you mean to say you couldn't have done it, if you had chosen? Demanded Monks, sternly. Haven't you done it, with other boys, scores of times? If you had had patience for a 12-month, at most, couldn't you have got him convicted, and sent safely out of the kingdom, perhaps for life? Whose turn would that have served, my dear? Inquired the Jew humbly. Mine, replied Monks. But not mine, said the Jew, submissively. He might have become of use to me. When there are two parties to a bargain, it is only reasonable that the interests of both should be consulted, is it, my good friend? What then? Demanded Monks. I saw it was not easy to train him to the business, replied the Jew. He was not like other boys in the same circumstances. Curse him, no, muttered the man, or he would have been a thief, long ago. I had no hold upon him to make him worse, pursued the Jew, anxiously watching the countenance of his companion. His hand was not in. I had nothing to frighten him with, which we always must have in the beginning, or we labor in vain. What could I do? Send him out with the Dodger and Charlie? We had enough of that, at first, my dear. I trembled for us all. That was not my doing, observed Monks. No, no, my dear, renewed the Jew. And I don't quarrel with it now, because, if it had never happened, you might never have clapped eyes on the boy to notice him, and so led to the discovery that it was him you were looking for. Well, I got him back for you by means of the girl, and then she begins to favor him. Throttle the girl, said Monks, impatiently. Why, we can't afford to do that just now, my dear, replied the Jew, smiling, and, besides, that sort of thing is not in our way, or, one of these days, I might be glad to have it done. I know what these girls are, Monks, well. As soon as the boy begins to harden, she'll care no more for him, than for a block of wood. You want him made a thief. If he is alive, I can make him one from this time, and, if, said the Jew, drawing nearer to the other, it's not likely, mind, but if the worst comes to the worst, and he is dead. It's no fault of mine if he is, interposed the other man, with a look of terror, and clasping the Jew's arm with trembling hands. Mind that. Fagin. I had no hand in it. Anything but his death, I told you from the first. I won't shed blood, it's always found out, and haunts a man besides. If they shot him dead, I was not the cause, do you hear me? Fire this infernal den. What's that? What? Cried the Jew, grasping the coward round the body, with both arms, as he sprung to his feet. Where? Yonder, replied the man, glaring at the opposite wall. The shadow. I saw the shadow of a woman, in a cloak and bonnet, pass along the wainscot like a breath. The Jew released his hold, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing where it had been placed. It showed them only the empty staircase, and their own white faces. They listened intently, a profound silence reigned throughout the house. It's your fancy, said the Jew, taking up the light and turning to his companion. I'll swear I saw it, replied Monks, trembling. It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke, it darted away. The Jew glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and, telling him he could follow, if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked into all the rooms, they were cold, bare, and empty. They descended into the passage, and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung upon the low walls, the tracks of the snail and slug glistened in the light of the candle, but all was still as death. What do you think now? Said the Jew, when they had regained the passage. Besides ourselves, there's not a creature in the house except Toby and the boys, and they're safe enough. See here. As a proof of the fact, the Jew drew forth 2 keys from his pocket, and explained, that when he first went downstairs, he had locked them in, to prevent any intrusion on the conference. This accumulated testimony effectually staggered Mr. Monks. His protestations had gradually become less and less vehement as they proceeded in their search without making any discovery, and, now, he gave vent to several very grim laughs, and confessed it could only have been his excited imagination. He declined any renewal of the conversation, however, for that night, suddenly remembering that it was past 1 o'clock. And so the amiable couple parted. Chapter 27 Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter, which deserted a lady, most unceremoniously. As it would be, by no means, seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beadle waiting, with his back to the fire, and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms, until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him, and as it would still less become his station, or his gallantry to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words, which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of maid or matron of whatsoever degree, the historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank, and, by consequence, great virtues, imperatively claim at his hands. Towards this end, indeed, he had purposed to introduce, in this place, a dissertation touching the divine right of beadles, and elucidative of the position, that a beadle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity, on the arrival of which, he will be prepared to show, that a beadle properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beadle, attached to a parochial workhouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellences and best qualities of humanity, and that to none of those excellences, can mere company's beadles, or court-of-law beadles, or even chapel of ease beadles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar tongs, made a closer inspection of the milk pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times, before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking. As there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time, if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole, to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dried lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving, in course of time, at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which, being shaken, gave forth a pleasant sound, as of the chinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and, resuming his old attitude, said, with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration, by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then, he took a view of his legs in profile, with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey, when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself, in a breathless state, on a chair by the fireside, and covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart, and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron, "what is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me." "I'm on." Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "broken bottles." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I have been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am," exclaimed Mr. Bumble, "who has dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself, with native majesty, "this is them wicious paupers." "It's dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine." "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't, oh. The top shelf in the right-hand corner, oh." Uttering these words, the good lady pointed, distractedly, to the cupboard, and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and, snatching a pint green-glass bottle from the shelf thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back, after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and, bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint," exclaimed Mrs. Corney, in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beetle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It's very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beetle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beetle. Nothing was said on either side, for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney. And she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble looking round. "Another room, and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble, in soft accents. Mrs. Corney." Mrs. Corney drooped her head. When the beetle said this, the beetle drooped his, to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away, and released her hand to get at her pocket handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beetle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection," exclaimed Mr. Bumble, rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse tonight, my fascinator." "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney, bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment, his death will cause a vacancy, that vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What a opportunity for a gening of hearts and housekeepings!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word," said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney." Yes," sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beetle, "compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length summoning up courage, she threw her arms around Mr. Bumble's neck, and said, it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was an irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary, by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint, "I'll call at Sourberry's as I go home, and tell him to send tomorrow morning." "Was it that as frightened you, love?" "It wasn't anything particular, dear," said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Won't you tell your own bee?" "Not now," rejoined the lady, one of these days. After we're married, dear. After we're married, exclaimed Mr. Bumble. It wasn't any impudence from any of them male paupers as. No, no, love, interposed the lady, hastily. If I thought it was, continued Mr. Bumble, if I thought as any one of them had dared to lift his vulgar eyes to that lovely countenance. They wouldn't have dared to do it, love, responded the lady. They had better not, said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. Let me see any man, parochial or extra-parochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time. Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed no very high compliment to the lady's charms, but, as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested, with great admiration, that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat collar, and put on his cocked hat, and, having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing, for a few minutes, in the male paupers' ward, to abuse them a little, with the view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart, and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but, attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlor at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward, and when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper, the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter pot and a wine bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy chair, with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open clasp knife in one hand, and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow, with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated. These symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties, in cases of internal fever, could have sufficiently accounted. "Here's a delicious fat one, Noah, dear," said Charlotte, "try him, do, only this one." "What a delicious thing is a oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole, after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is, a number of them should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?" "It's quite a cruelty," said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Ain't you fond of oysters?" "Not overmuch," replied Charlotte. "I like to see you eat 'em, Noah dear, better than eating 'em myself." "Lor," said Noah, reflectively, "how queer." "Have another," said Charlotte. "Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard." "I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry." "Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss yer." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir." Charlotte uttered a scream, and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beadle in drunken terror. "Say it again, you vile, audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir? And how dare you encourage him, you insolent minx?" "Kiss her," exclaimed Mr. Bumble, in strong indignation. "Faugh! I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a-kissing of me, whether I like it, or not." "Oh, Noah," cried Charlotte, reproachfully. You know you are, retorted Noah. She's always a-doin' of it, Mr. Bumble, sir, she chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love. Silence, cried Mr. Bumble, sternly. Take yourself downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop, say another word till your master comes home, at your peril, and, when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he was to send a old woman's shell after breakfast tomorrow morning. Do you hear, sir? Kissing, cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone for ever. With these words, the beadle strode, with a lofty and gloomy air, from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far on his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquires after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. Chapter 28. Looks after Oliver, and proceeds with his adventures. Wolves tear your throats, muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. I wish I was among some of you, you'd howl the hoarser for it. As Sikes growled forth this imprecation, with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee, and turned his head, for an instant, to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out, in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighboring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. Stop, you white-livered hound, cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. Stop! The repetition of the word, brought Toby to a dead standstill. For he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with. Bear a hand with the boy, cried Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. Come back. Toby made a show of returning, but ventured, in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. Quicker, cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. Don't play booty with me. At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. It's all up, Bill, cried Toby, drop the kid, and show 'em your heels. With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend, to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail, and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look around, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver, the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge, as if to distract the attention of those behind, from the spot where the boy lay, paused, for a second, before another hedge which met it at right angles, and whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone. Ho, ho, there, cried a tremulous voice in the rear. Pincher! Neptune! Come here, come here! The dogs, who, in common with their masters, seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command. 3 men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together. My advice, or, leastways, I should say, my orders, is, said the fattest man of the party, that we immediately go home again. I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles, said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face, and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen, said the third, who had called the dogs back, Mr. Giles ought to know. Certainly, replied the shorter man, and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him. No, no, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation. To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke. You are afraid, Brittles, said Mr. Giles. I ain't, said Brittles. You are, said Giles. You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles, said Brittles. You're a lie, Brittles, said Mr. Giles. Now, these four retorts arose from Mr. Giles's taunt, and Mr. Giles's taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again, imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close, most philosophically. I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen, said he, we're all afraid. Speak for yourself, sir, said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party. So I do, replied the man. It's natural and proper to be afraid, under such circumstances. I am. So am I, said Brittles, only there's no call to tell a man he is, so bounceably. These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid, upon which, they all three faced about, and ran back again with the completest unanimity, until Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, as was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping, to make an apology for his hastiness of speech. But it's wonderful, said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, what a man will do, when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of them rascals. As the other two were impressed with a similar presentiment, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament. I know what it was, said Mr. Giles, it was the gate. I shouldn't wonder if it was, exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea. You may depend upon it, said Giles, that gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away, as I was climbing over it. By a remarkable coincidence, the other two had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars, and a travelling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion. Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but, keeping very close together, notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round, whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the three men hurried back to a tree, behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home, at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, the light might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder, as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways, and low places, were all mire and water, the damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by, with a hollow moaning. Still, Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing, as its first dull hue, the death of night, rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness, grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down, thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes. But, Oliver felt it not, as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length, a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side. The bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak, that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture. When he had done so, he looked feebly round for help, and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint, from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but, shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there, he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man. But he kept up, nevertheless, and, with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now, hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said, sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then, he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as on the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly, he started back at the report of firearms. There rose into the air, loud cries and shouts, lights gleamed before his eyes, all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions, there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping, almost mechanically, between the bars of gates, or through hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road. Here the rain began to fall so heavily, that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings, than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling come over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall. On the grass inside, he had fallen on his knees last night, and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place, that, for the instant, he forgot the agony of his wound, and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, whither could he fly? He pushed against the garden gate, it was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and, his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that about this time, Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker, were recruiting themselves, after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries, in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to too great familiarity the humbler servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But, death, fires, and burglary, make all men equals, so Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while, with his right, he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3, when I woke up, and, turning round in my bed, as it might be so," here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair, and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes, "I fancied I heard a noise." At this point of the narrative the cook turned pale, and asked the housemaid to shut the door, Who asked Brittles? Who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear? Heard a noise, continued Mr. Giles. I says, at first, this is illusion, and was composing myself off to sleep, when I heard the noise again, distinct. What sort of a noise? Asked the cook. A kind of a busting noise, replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. More like the noise of powdering a iron bar on a nutmeg grater, suggested Brittles. It was, when you heard it, sir, rejoined Mr. Giles, but, at this time, it had a busting sound. I turned down the clothes, continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, sat up in bed, and listened. The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated, "Lor," and drew their chairs closer together. I heard it now, quite apparent, resumed Mr. Giles. Somebody, I says, is forcing of a door, or window. What's to be done? I'll call up that poor lad, Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat, I says, may be cut from his right ear to his left, without his ever knowing it. Here, all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker, and stared at him, with his mouth wide open, and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. I tossed off the clothes, said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth, and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of ladies present, Mr. Giles, murmured the tinker. Of shoes, sir, said Giles, turning upon him, and laying great emphasis on the word, seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. Brittles, I says, when I had woke him, don't be frightened. So you did, observed Brittles, in a low voice. We're dead men, I think, Brittles, I says, continued Giles, but don't be frightened. Was he frightened? Asked the cook. Not a bit of it, replied Mr. Giles. He was as firm, pretty near as firm as I was. I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me, observed the housemaid. You're a woman, retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. Brittles is right, said Mr. Giles, nodding his head, approvingly. From a woman, nothing else was to be expected. We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittles' hob, and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so. Mr. Giles had risen from his seat, and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut, to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. It was a knock, said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. Open the door, somebody. Nobody moved. It seems a strange sort of a thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning, said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself, but the door must be opened. Do you hear, somebody? Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. If Brittles would rather open the door, in the presence of witnesses, said Mr. Giles, after a short silence, I am ready to make one. So am I, said the tinker, waking up, as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front. The 2 women, who were afraid to stay below, brought up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside, that they were strong in numbers, and by a masterstroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched, in the hall, to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed. The group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes, and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly, pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the, why, Brittles, look here, don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver, than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall, and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is," bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement, up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am. Here's a thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss," and Brittles held the light. "In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth, so that his voice might travel the better. The two women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavoring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss, I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush," replied the young lady, "you frighten my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt?" "Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles, with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he was going, miss," bawled Brittles, in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the lady. "Wait quietly only one instant, while I speak to aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away. She soon returned, with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried, carefully, upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place, he was to dispatch, with all speed, a constable and doctor. "But won't you take one look at him, first, miss?" asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage, that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss." "Not now, for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh! Treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker, as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs, with the care and solicitude of a woman. Chapter 29 has an introductory account of the inmates of the house, to which Oliver resorted. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort, than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some halfway between the sideboard and the breakfast table, and, with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back, and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side, grasping a waiter, looked like one who labored under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat, was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision, in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat, in a stately manner, with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were attentively upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age, when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17. Cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eye, and was stamped upon her noble head, seemed scarcely of her age, or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humour, the thousand lights that played about the face, and left no shadow there, above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home, and fireside peace and happiness. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table. Chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her, she playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into her beaming look such an expression of affection and artless loveliness, that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her. "And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?" asked the old lady, after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch, which he drew forth by a black ribbon. "He is always slow," remarked the old lady. "Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am," replied the attendant. And seeing, by the by, that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. "He gets worse instead of better, I think," said the elder lady. "It is very inexcusable in him if he stops to play with any other boys," said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and who, getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room, and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together. "I never heard of such a thing," exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of the night, too, I never heard of such a thing." With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves. "You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright," said the fat gentleman. "Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances. Dear, dear. So unexpected. In the silence of the night, too." The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected, and attempted in the night time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment, by post, a day or two previous. "And you, Miss Rose," said the doctor, turning to the young lady, "Oh. Very much so, indeed," said Rose, interrupting him, "but there is a poor creature upstairs, whom aunt wishes you to see." "Ah. To be sure," replied the doctor, "so there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand." Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had had that honor. "Honor, eh?" said the doctor, "well, I don't know, perhaps it's as honorable to hit a thief in a back kitchen, as to hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air, and you fought a duel, Giles." Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully, that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party. "Gad, that's true," said the doctor. "Where is he? Show me the way. I'll look in again, as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window that he got in at, eh? Well, I couldn't have believed it." Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs, and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed, that Mr. Losberne, a surgeon in the neighborhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as, the doctor, had grown fat, more from good humor than from good living, and was as kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric an old bachelor, as will be found in 5 times that space, by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious, and closed the door, carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door, as if to keep it shut. "He is not in danger, I hope," said the old lady. "Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing, under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is." "Have you seen the thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady. "Nor heard anything about him?" "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Mr. Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losberne came in." The fact was, that Mr. Giles had not, at first, been able to bring his mind to the avowal, that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery, that he could not, for the life of him, help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished, in the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." "Humph," rejoined the doctor. "There is nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I am quite sure that you would deeply regret not having done so, if you postponed it. He is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me?" "Not the slightest fear, I pledge you my honor." Chapter 30 relates what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. With many loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them, with much ceremony and stateliness, upstairs. "Now," said the doctor, in a whisper, as he softly turned the handle of a bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he don't look at all ferocious notwithstanding. Stop, though. Let me first see that he is in visiting order." Stepping before them, he looked into the room. Motioning them to advance, he closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound and splintered up, was crossed upon his breast, his head reclined upon the other arm, which was half hidden by his long hair, as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand, and looked on, for a minute or so, in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face. As she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred, and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known. Thus, a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odor of a flower, or the mention of a familiar word, will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were, in this life, which vanish like a breath, which some brief memory of a happier existence, long gone by, would seem to have awakened, which no voluntary exertion of the mind can ever recall. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers. Vice," said the surgeon, replacing the curtain, "takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her? But at so early an age, urged Rose. My dear young lady, rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head, crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims. But, can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society, said Rose. The surgeon shook his head, in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment. But even if he has been wicked, pursued Rose, think how young he is, think that he may never have known a mother's love, or the comfort of a home, that ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake, think of this, before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh! As you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late. My dear love, said the elder lady, as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom, do you think I would harm a hair of his head? Oh, no, replied Rose, eagerly. No, surely, said the old lady, my days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir? Let me think, ma'am, said the doctor, let me think. Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets, and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping, and balancing himself on his toes, and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of, I've got it now, and, no, I haven't, and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt, and spoke as follows. I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles, and that little boy, Brittles, I can manage it. Giles is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that? Unless there is some other way of preserving the child, replied Mrs. Maylie. There is no other, said the doctor. No other, take my word for it. Then my aunt invests you with full power, said Rose, smiling through her tears, but pray don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary. You seem to think, retorted the doctor, that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted today, except yourself, Miss Rose. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion, and I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself, on the spot, of such a favorable opportunity for doing so, as the present. You are as great a boy as poor Brittles himself, returned Rose, blushing. Well, said the doctor, laughing heartily, that is no very difficult matter. But to return to this boy. The great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say, and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to, on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now I make this stipulation, that I shall examine him in your presence, and that, if, from what he says, we judge, and I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reason, that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate, without any farther interference on my part, at all events. Oh no, aunt, entreated Rose. Oh yes, aunt, said the doctor. Is it a bargain? He cannot be hardened in vice, said Rose, it is impossible. Very good, retorted the doctor, then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition. Finally the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereunto sat down to wait, with some impatience, until Oliver should awake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losberne had led them to expect, for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence, that he was at length sufficiently restored to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something, that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity, than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one. Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop, by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing, to hear, in the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh! If when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising, slowly it is true, but not less surely, to heaven, to pour thereafter vengeance on our heads, if we heard but one instant, in imagination, the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle, and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong, that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by gentle hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again, than the doctor, after wiping his eyes, and condemning them for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles. And finding nobody about the parlours, it occurred to him, that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen, so into the kitchen he went. There were assembled, in that lower house of the domestic parliament, the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day, in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half-boots, and he looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind, when the doctor entered. Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything, before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Missus wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and was disposed for company, I am taking mine among them here." Brittles headed a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles's condescension. Mr. Giles looked round with a patronizing air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would never desert them. "How is the patient tonight, sir?" asked Giles. "So," returned the doctor. "I am afraid you have got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Mr. Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die." "If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off, no, not even Brittles here, not for all the plate in the county, sir." "That's not the point," said the doctor, mysteriously. "Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant?" "Yes, sir, I hope so," faltered Mr. Giles, who had turned very pale. "And what are you, boy?" said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles. "Lord bless me, sir," replied Brittles, starting violently, "I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir." "Then tell me this," said the doctor, both of you. "Are you going to take upon yourselves to swear, that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come. We are prepared for you." The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger, that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. "Pay attention to the reply, constable, will you?" said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. Something may come of this before long. The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. "It's a simple question of identity, you will observe," said the doctor. "That's what it is, sir," replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way. "Here's the house broken into," said the doctor, and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy, in the midst of gunpowder smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness. "Here's a boy comes to that very same house, next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which, they place his life in great danger, and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is, whether these men are justified by the fact, if not, in what situation do they place themselves?" The constable nodded profoundly. He said, if that wasn't law, he would be glad to know what was. "I ask you again," thundered the doctor, "are you, on your solemn oaths, able to identify that boy?" Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles, Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles, the constable put his hand behind his ear, to catch the reply, the two women and the tinker leaned forward to listen, the doctor glanced keenly round, when a ring was heard at the gate, and at the same moment, the sound of wheels. "It's the runners," cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle, "me and Mr. Giles sent for 'em this morning." "What?" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles, "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wonder they weren't here before, sir." "You did you? Then confound your slow coaches down here, that's all," said the doctor, walking away.